Sitting beside me in the studio, Jacinda Ardern, welcome
Good
to
evening.
Checkpoint.
Thank you.
And just before we go on, and I know this is a personal matter and we don't, want to go ploughing in there, but you lost your granny this morning, didn't you?
I did. I lost my grandmother this morning.
And I'm really sorry about that.
Thank you, John. Yeah.
Yeah.
Life just it continues to happen around you despite the drama of politics. And it's always a stark reminder of that, and that there are lots of important things that we should always focus on outside of our jobs.
Yeah.
So, thank you, John.
So we have had Bill English, Winston Peters, James Shaw, Marama Fox and David Seymour in the Checkpoint studio talking to us about what they want, what they believe in, how they're going to achieve it. And you are our final leader before the election on Saturday, although about 500,000 people have voted. How are you going? And forgive me for asking this question, but what did Hobbes say? Life is nasty, brutish and short, but the campaign trail is worse, isn't it? It really is exhausting.
I've enjoyed this campaign an enormous amount, and I think probably all political leaders in some form or another draw real strength from the campaign. For example, I just spent probably an hour or so down at Victoria University. The number of young people who came out, acknowledged that they had already voted, and then spent an hour with me just to talk one-on-one and share their stories was incredible.
What are their stories?
The thing that has astounded me the most are the number of people who come to tell me their stories about mental health. If you'd asked me a year ago if that would be an issue that I would hear time and time again on the campaign trail, I just wouldn't have picked it. And yet it has been, hands down, particularly when I've been on university campuses, but actually everywhere. It's certainly beaten any other issue. I
want to come back to health, and I want to talk about it at length, how we get the health system right, if it's not already right. But I was just fascinated. Bryce Edwards put out his political roundup yesterday, and the question was, is a youth quake looming or not? And he was crunching the numbers, because the wisdom is that you will galvanise young people to vote Labour. He was saying, as of today, which is yesterday, the total enrolments of 18 to 24-year-olds stands at 314,000 out of an estimated eligible population of 460,000, which means that only 68% of this age group has enrolled. This is actually less than this time 3 years ago. Now, you need the young voters to become government, don't you? Is that a statement of fact?
I think we need high turnout to become government. I think that's fair. And certainly we've been pushing the message that as many people as possible who are able to vote early should, because that removes any issue around enrolment. Some people don't know you cannot enrol and vote on election day. I think it's an anomaly we should change, but it exists in law. So that basically means that if there's any problem with your enrolment, if you leave it till Saturday, it's too late. In last election, 27,000 people went and cast a vote that did not count.
Okay, so if the young people don't vote in big numbers, and if the turnout is not high, are you going to be the next Prime Minister of New Zealand?
I think it will be harder. So turnout is incredibly important.
How tight is it now, do you think?
I think it's so hard to get a grasp. The polls show us in front on some and National in front on the others. So I think that what that tells us is that it's very, very close.
What's your internal polling telling you?
That we're close.
Yeah,
we're close.
And that's what the Nats. Yeah. And that's a convenient narrative for you both to run, because you want to turn your voters out, right? You want to. Yeah.
But it also happens to be the truth.
Yeah, and I think both parties are saying that.
Yeah. It is close. It is close. And again, that's where turnout will be key. And again, we know from those surveys that are carried out after elections, from those who choose or have not voted but were enrolled to, they'll often say that they didn't think that their vote would count this time. It'll count.
Do you like Bill English?
I do, actually, yeah. Yep. Do you know, I will, I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying this. He sent me a message of condolence around my grandmother. There are people in politics who just, at their heart, are just good people. And in politics, I think that there are those people on both sides.
So why should you be Prime Minister instead of him?
Because I have a vision for New Zealand that contrasts greatly with his. We can, of course, disagree, and I think that he has run the economy competently, but I think
is that damning with faint praise?
No, it's not, because that is not an easy job. I think anyone who's done the job, I'm sure Michael Cullen would agree, it's a tough job. But after 9 years, I think they've demonstrated what their priorities are, and it hasn't been health. and it hasn't been housing, and to a large degree it hasn't been education. And for me, those are the basics. When you get those right, that's when New Zealand flourishes. So I think he's done what he came here to do. You get a sense of a government's priority and the kind of record they'll leave after 9 years. I don't think that we should trust in them to take us any further than where we've come.
Okay, you talk about vision. The big V word, and you use it a lot. I want to go back to your maiden speech in Parliament in 2008, right? Because that's where you articulated a vision that has remained remarkably consistent until today. And then I want to drill down into how you're going to achieve it. So let's listen. Now, your dad was the police officer in Murupara for a while, right? And you talked about your introduction, really, to poverty as a young person living in Murupara.
I knew there were suicides, and that the girl that used to babysit my sister and I one day turned yellow from hepatitis and couldn't visit us anymore. But I didn't understand the linkages between these things and the poverty of the community that I was living in. My passion for social justice came from what I saw. My love of politics came when I realised that it was the key to changing what I saw.
Okay, how do you change it? Let's set the vision aside. How do you change? And you've mentioned suicide tonight since you've been here. You've mentioned mental health being discussed by the Victoria University students. You mentioned suicide in your maiden speech. You mentioned the pressures of poverty. How do you change it?
Yeah, and I do think we need to go back to that question, what do we do to resolve deprivation and inequality in New Zealand?
Answer it.
It's about income. It is. If we're going to boil it right down, the reason that internationally all our measures around poverty are based on income is because it matters. That is where people are able to get their source of dignity, their ability to put food on the table, to pay for a decent house and warm their home.
Bill English would agree with you, wouldn't he? And he would say that's our tax cut package, and also accommodation supplement increases, which actually you would stick with if you were in government, right?
We would. But my argument to him would be, you've just spent $2 billion on tax cuts that mean that I get a tax cut and that he gets a tax cut. That is not an efficient way to deliver to people who need it most. So we took a different view. We said no to a tax cut for the top earners in New Zealand. Instead, we designed a package that means 70% of families will be better off under what we've designed than what they would be under a tax cut. And that's because we've got an amazing tool in New Zealand called Working for Families. It goes to our lower middle income New Zealanders. It's highly targeted. I think of it as a targeted tax cut. And through that, we've designed something that I think will lift, well, actually, I know, will reach every single family currently living in poverty in New Zealand.
There have been some exclusions around Working for Families with beneficiaries. That will not be the case under your family's package.
Actually, Working for Families, there's only one element that doesn't go, and it's actually not the most generous part. The most important part of Working for Families is the family tax credit. That equates to about, in the past it's been about 5,300 from memory per child over the course of a year. That is the most generous part. That part goes to everyone who meets the income test, regardless of whether they're on a benefit or not.
And you are retaining the National Accommodation Supplement, right? Yeah. Exactly. So that will increase people's ability to pay rent. Do you worry that, in fact, more money going into the market will just mean that predacious and cynical landlords increase rents?
Our view is it's not enough. You know, accommodation supplement does not solve our housing crisis. We've got to stop selling state houses. We've got to start building homes and building more places for social housing as well. Is
GST a socially just tax? Because you talk about not giving you and I a tax cut, right? Yes. Relatively high income people. But if you and I go and buy a loaf of bread, we pay the same tax on it as the poorest people in New Zealand.
No doubt. But when I've looked at the makeup of what we're able to do, for instance, yes, we could, for instance, take GST off certain food items, for instance. That wouldn't necessarily maintain a low food price for that person purchasing it. On the flip side, what I can do for Working for Families could deliver a much, much bigger take for that family. Because I want to come back to one other element, John, quickly, that is very different to what National's proposed. I talk a lot about something called Best Start. I feel very strongly about it. When I looked at all of the evidence around poverty in New Zealand, the period that children spend the longest in poverty is 0 to 4. And there's an obvious reason why. It is much harder for a family to maintain work and care duties during that period. It eases off once, of course, early childhood kicks in and you see parents juggling work and care. So what do we do about that 0 to 3? It's the most important stage of a child's development. So that's why we created a targeted payment again for low and middle income families in that 0 to 3 years. That's $60 a week. We know that'll make a huge difference to those families and to those kids. And for anyone who right now is saying money doesn't solve the issue and how do you guarantee it goes to kids, research actually tells us you give a low-income family more money, those parents will spend it on their children. It's fact that's the way most families react.
How do you get, how does any political party get people who are disconnected, who are marginalised, who feel left behind, who feel excluded and who feel ignored to even participate in the process of society as you and I understand it?
You talk about their lives. You know, if anything
how do you talk about their lives? Because I'm really sorry to say it. You know, they ain't listening to this interview. Now we're starting to engage with a whole new audience on Facebook and I hope they watch all our leaders' interviews. But actually a lot of them don't participate in the political process at all, and that is because they feel left behind by it, they feel ignored by it, and they will cite Labor governments as much as national governments. And you know that if we go back to the 84-90 Labor government, there is a generation of people who feel betrayed by them.
And we're still paying for that now. I'm a child of the 80s, you know. I saw in the 90s the user pay approach, and now we're asking that generation who have really lost out on some of those benefits that went before them to pay it forward to the next generation. But the difference, I guess, between the way we do politics, Labor has always been a grassroots movement, and there's a reason for that. We know the most... Well, yes, actually. We spend as much time now knocking on doors and having phone conversations with people as we ever have. In fact, more so.
But so does the National Party.
Not like...
And the National Party would say, actually, we connect with the grassroots. There are actually grassroots. I mean, look at Bill English working provincial New Zealand, and people are pleased to see him there.
What I'm talking about are hundreds and hundreds of volunteers who for months and months now have been out knocking on those doors. That's always the way we've operated. We've never been the party of big donations. We've been the party of people power.
Okay.
And the reason those conversations are important to us is someone going out and talking to someone about the ideas that we have that will have a material impact on their lives is going to be much more effective than any billboard, any flyer, any ad or any interview that I do.
You used the phrase material impact, and you are using facts and figures tonight. Did you leave yourself open at the beginning of the campaign by not using facts and figures rigorously? Stephen Joyce's $11.7 billion fiscal hole, which...
Okay,
look, I know that we've all heard from the economists ad infinitum. We've had them on Checkpoint saying there isn't an $11.7 billion. But in the meantime, he made the running and he got the headlines. I've got, and I used it with Winston Peters last night, Labor's water tax mean $18 cabbages.
Can I come back to that first example you used?
Except that I want to speak to the specific holes you left by not being specific.
But you've mentioned Stephen Joyce's apparent, now disproven, hole in the fiscal plan. That was taken from a huge amount of detail that we released, pages on exactly what we were spending and where and how we were going to pay for it. That was an example of us putting out detail for voters so they knew exactly what we intended to do in government.
Except you said, tax policy, we're going to have a tax working group, we'll get back to you on what we're going to do. Now, surely, had you painted a target on your forehead, you wouldn't have given a more explicit invitation to the Nats to have a go.
No, well, what they did on the fiscal plan was utterly wrong because we actually presented that detail. There was a huge amount of it, and Stephen Joyce manipulated the data that was there, and he was wrong. Let me come back to the issue, though, of the tax working group. You know, I have undertaken a plan around making sure that when I come in office, I have the ability to tackle that housing crisis head on.
How?
Because
How?
after 9 years,
How?
I am not willing to just sit back and say extending the Bright Line test is enough, because
Okay.
it might not be.
How?
So we will bring together experts in the field, and I've given them 2 particularly clear directions. I want to look at fairness, someone who flicks off 5 homes to make an income versus someone who goes out and works 40 hours a week. We need to be fair in the way we treat those 2 individuals. And the second bit of direction is I don't want to bring in the family home into how we work on this. When I said that, I of course meant land that sits under the family home as well, and I was happy to clarify that. But the feedback that I got,
if
John...
you've been in opposition for 9 years, now I know you've been leader for how many weeks?
6.5.
Yeah, exactly. So why weren't you ready to go to the market with this policy?
We have had a policy around having that tax working
and you
group.
resigned from it, right? I mean, sorry,
I brought it forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so what's changed over the course of the campaign? I've maintained the urgency. I still believe it exists. We need to do that work so that that next generation can get into owning a home, and so we have a decent, fair and just tax system. When I looked at, I always said that work would take quite a while. When I looked at the timeline and I heard the feedback that the public wanted certainty, leadership is about listening too. I knew that by actually delaying a few months, I could provide both my urgency and that certainty.
Right. Do you want a capital gains tax? Is it a fair tax, do you think? And let's say explicitly now you don't want to apply it to the family home or the land underneath
That's
it.
correct.
Full stop.
Yep.
Setting that aside, are you interested in applying it to other things?
The rest, my primary focus has been speculation and fairness in our tax system, but I do want to leave room for that group to undertake the work that we're setting out for them. But
why is it so? If the person who cleans the toilets in this office has to pay income tax, why is it so hard to sell a capital gains tax on speculation on property?
Oh, well, I think it's a fair question to be asking. It's why we've said we would extend the Bright Line test so that someone who flicks off a home within 5 years. And so that is something that we've picked up and we're absolutely going to undertake. But I want to keep doing the rest of that work as well. But John, we've got to, look, we are 4 days out from an election. The question we need to be asking ourselves is why we even have had this debate, this election. Why have we even had the debate around water this election? Because I am lucky enough...
You raised it. I walked 400 metres to where you announced your water policy,
Yep.
right?
And
at the hotel down the road.
I have raised
and I
it.
said to you that day, how much is this going to cost farmers? And you said, we're working on that. Now, what did you expect would happen then?
We always had an expectation that it would be in the range of cents. Did we expect the National Party to come out and claim ludicrously that there would be $18 cabbages? No.
That was Winston
But
Peters.
of course, and the rest. But wait, I'm tracking back here, John. We've got to get back to basics. The reason we are having this conversation...
Sorry to interrupt, but I was watching the telly with you out there while Katrina was reading the news, and one of the networks, well, they both led with the airport, right? And you had a go at the government over... There was a little 12-second soundbite from you having a go at the government over the pipe not working, right? In other words, you give a politician an opportunity to land a blow and they're gonna, right?
If I was reflecting the fact that this was raised in 2012, and I think that's probably fair. I think probably most people would say, how did this happen? Fair question. But again, how did it happen that we're even having a conversation about water, about speculators? Because we are in a position after 9 years where we should be analysing the record, yes, of Labour, but also of National. This is an election that is about making big calls. Now, there is risk with saying that we just drift along for another 3 years, leave our waterways as they are, not resolve the issue around people making a profit out of bottling water without having a royalty, not deal with property speculators. We can go down that track, but we cannot as a country expect things to improve unless we have these tough conversations. I've taken political risks this election campaign, and I stand by all of them because they were about issues I cared deeply about.
Do you stand by them less now than you did at the start of the campaign?
No, not at all.
In other words, have you shied away from some of them?
No, not at all. Yes, on the issue around the working group, I still maintain that work needs to be done and it will be done. But am I at the same time able to listen to voters, put in a couple of extra months and make sure they get a say? Yes. But leadership's about that too.
Can we talk about health? You said in a story we had on Checkpoint earlier in the program that the health system is underfunded by $2.3 billion.
That's correct.
Where does that figure come from?
We had analysis done independently around whether or not health funding had been inflation adjusted and for population growth and population changes.
And do you believe that that has directly impacted on the kind of things that we have been covering on Checkpoint at length, particularly out of the Southern DHB?
Absolutely.
Right, so how is that resolved?
Simply by priorities. You know, we've said the reason that we've not adopting the tax cuts of National, that gives us about $8 billion across 4 years, is explicitly because we've underfunded too many of our core services, and health included.
I asked Winston Peters last night who was going to be the next Prime Minister of New Zealand, and he wouldn't answer. Of course. You've got to call James Shaw first, don't you?
Yes, yep, and that's the agreement that we have.
Do you think the Greens are going to be above 5?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. The polling I'm hearing is showing that now.
Yes.
Do you want the Greens to be above 5?
I think they play an important role in politics. Yep.
Would you like to be able to be in government with the Greens without New Zealand First, or are you reserving your right to talk to whoever it takes to be in government?
I want to be in government. I want Labour to be in a position to have a mandate to form a government. But I think that voters who vote for Labour will be voting for a change of government. There'll be an expectation from them that we do what it takes to form a decent, progressive government.
Is progressive a word you would associate with New Zealand First?
Oh, there are some shared values there. Yeah.
Some shared values around immigration.
But you've got to remember that it's Labour, of course. If you're the major party, then you're the one that dictates. Would the Māori Party necessarily align themselves with the National Party in that regard? Probably not.
Immigration, are you still looking at an estimated reduction of 20 to 30,000 people?
That's the estimate off the back of the policies and the settings that we're changing.
Are you doing that for the right reason, or are you playing to the New Zealand First constituency?
No, we are doing it for the right reasons. I have sat
really,
in
Phil Twyford, Phil Twyford looking for Chinese surnames?
That was wrong. That was wrong. But I have sat in my office and had students in particular who are in New Zealand who are being exploited by some of the employers they're working for. That is not good for them. That is not good for New Zealand. They still want to be in
New Zealand though, don't they?
Yeah, and I understand that, and on the right terms that should be the case, but not for exploitation.
Are you going to be the next Prime Minister of New Zealand?
Yes.
Are you?
Yes, I am.
Are you saying that because you need to believe it, or because you think the youngsters and the people who are disenfranchised and don't think that politics is for them any longer are going to make the effort to vote?
I'm saying it because I cannot fathom another 3 years of New Zealand drifting when we need action. I cannot fathom our mental health statistics continuing to decline, you know, housing being out of reach and our environment continuing to be degraded. I believe we can do better than this, and I desperately want to do that.
Jacinda Ardern, thank you for joining us. That is Checkpoint for this evening.